And joining us in studio is Tepo Khadima, a political analyst, and we have Zamuo Madlala from the Radical Economic Transformation Coalition as their spokesperson. Joining us on the phone line, Leon Lowe, Free Market Foundation Executive Director, joins us via Skype. And we'll also have Adil Ntabeleng, Transform RSA President. Good evening to all our guests, and thanks so much for joining us. So, but just the extent of what seems to be mismanagement at PIC. At this stage, we're looking at allegations, but earlier we had spoken about S&S refinery in Mozambique, a huge investment of which the plant is not even operational. What do you make out of this?
Well, I think what is really shocking about that incident or that example is that to date there still hasn't been any explanation as to what exactly there was being invested into, and what is the state of that. Has there been just was PIC defrauded? And I think the CEO of PIC really owes it to the pensioners, the government employee pension funds, whose money was invested. By the way, I think it's $38 million US in equity, and there was another $60 or $64 million that was put in as a loan. Therefore, bringing, I think, the investment in totality to over 100, and hence there's been this figure of R1 billion that has been bandied about, that R1 billion effectively was just handed out to this entity in Mozambique. We don't know what the progress is. I've done a little bit of read-up on it, on whatever that was available. It's actually not an oil refinery, but it would appear that it was a bio refinery where there was to be some harvesting of some biomaterial. I don't know what type of biomaterial was, which will then have been refined into biofuel, either biodiesel or something to that effect, or it was vegetable oil. Again, the details are very murky, but this is absolutely horrendous. But why do we care about the PIC? When you look at there was a thing called, I think, ESG, which talks about the environment, sustainability, as well as the growth, to ensure that whatever investments that they are investing into, they are responsible environmentally, that there is growth and that jobs can be created. So let's now ask a question. It would have helped right now as they were disclosing not just the Isibaya fund, which is the R46 billion that has been invested in various companies, but actually to look at the entire portfolio of the PIC and ask a question as to what is the exact economic value that investment is having, but also its ability to, if you look at it in terms of government employees, we have not seen the state retrenching. If anything, you've got a sort of a stable outlook where you can project what your pension receipts would be. And we have not seen a massive number of government employees retiring to the extent that will then be worried and say, well, I need to have liquidity. I need to be keeping a lot of cash so that I can be able to pay those pensioners on a monthly basis. So that is the one thing that is, I think, it's raising alarm bells. But I'm thinking about it on these following terms, that if you've got R2 trillion assets under management, what we need to be actually told is that, well, what has been the average growth per year in the last 5 years, so that we can be able to do a proper comparison between PIC's performance, because they manage 80% of the money themselves. So we need to be able to see how effective, how astute are they as money managers, managing 80% of the 2 trillion, but also on the other hand, 400 billion rand, which constitutes 20%. They dish it out to the various money managers, the likes of Old Mutual Asset Managers, Investec, Coronation, Allen Gray, and all of that. And that is one of the areas where, again, there hasn't been a question as to the money that the 20% or 400 billion rand they've dished it out to these fund managers, exactly in terms of their criteria. What is the multiplier effect on the economy? Because they invest in equities, which effectively are shares listed on the JSE. But when you look at the companies that are listed on the JSE, it's just been it has been a casino, because people are just effectively, it's a gambling pool. There has not been new money getting through the JSE to develop productive sectors of the economy, therefore meaning we are not creating the jobs, which is the primary investment mandate which government employees pension funds is given to PIC, and those questions are not being asked. And black asset managers to this day continue to not even have 10% of the 400 billion rand which they dish out. And also 10% of the 2 trillion, which would be over 200 billion rand, gets invested offshore in offshore equities. Now we know, as a matter of fact, that the rand has weakened substantially. So therefore the performance of the PIC as a money manager has to be juxtaposed against the currency weakening, which in turn means that their performance should have been much higher than even the all-share index, if not matching the all-share index. But when I look at it, I think their average growth has been around 10%, and I'm saying that is a poor money management, and it's not surprising when you take into account some of the decisions that they've made. But 46 billion is a drop in the ocean. We have to look at the bigger figure and that's beyond the 46.
Exactly. I mean, that's the sense that we're getting, that there is more to the story than what we have in the public domain at the moment. Zamo Madlala is with the Radical Economic Transformation Coalition, joining us on the phone line. Thank you so much. What we got from TEP was essentially, and it seems that the PIC has failed in its fiduciary duties, that of ensuring that the bulk of the money that's invested, number one, yields the necessary returns for the government pensioners, and secondly, that there is so much money that seemingly is invested in deals that would give you even up to minus 70% returns. That in itself is an anomaly. And why would the PIC, manage pensioners' funds this way?
Good evening, Cindy, and to all the viewers on the panel. Well, what we must actually start looking at is that perhaps this is the greatest season in South Africa, because we are starting to look at all these things. It seems odd to me that somebody would say that 46 billion is a drop in the ocean, because it's not a drop in the ocean. Yes, it's a drop in the ocean if you look at the greater amounts, but when you look at 27% unemployment, 30.4 million people under the breadline, and you look at the performance of those very same investments that are sitting, that had the 46 billion put in them, it looks like it was a scattergun approach. People were throwing darts onto the dartboard to look at what investments to go into. Some of them are just downright illogical when you look at them and you try and assess them from a desktop point of view without knowing, obviously, the details of the transactions. So there are definitely questions that we need to ask the PIC, and at this point we wouldn't want to jump into conclusions. But when we look at it from the investment return point of view, there's no logic. When you look at the employment numbers, even on their own reports, they are stating there's lack of transformation. There's a couple of them where labor brokers are being used, and then I'm asking, how are you taking pensioners' money and having people being employed under labor broking contracts in investments that the PIC has put money into? Who was dotting the I's and crossing the T's? What are the investment principles and values? And these are the questions that now the PIC has to come and answer. And it's not just the CEO that's going to be on the spot. Perhaps what's going to happen is that we're going to end up having to relook everything when it comes to investment in our country. In terms of, we can't be having, because some of those investments in the Aspire Fund, some go to municipalities, some are about affordable housing development. How is that ever going to provide a return? Because for you to have affordable housing, chances are you're not going to make money. Hence, the commercial banks don't look at that sector. So the Department of Housing would be looking at that. So why is the PIC even funding such transactions? I don't even get it.
All right, just stay on the line first. Let's get a perspective from Leon Lowe, Free Market Foundation Executive Director. Thank you so much, Mr. Lowe, for your time. Now, Dan Machila making the comment that 46 billion rand of the PIC fund is a minuscule amount compared to the 2.2 trillion. But after all, these are pensioners' monies that we're talking about and not small change. What do you make out of this demeanor?
Yes, I think it's a very serious, and potentially there should be some criminal charges against the trustees or the fund managers. And the reason is they have one job and one job only. They have one fiduciary responsibility, which is to maximize the value of the investors. Now, let's understand who they are. The people whose money it is civil servants. I think something like 95% or so are black South Africans or black public servants, public officials, and it is their private money. And one of the problems is that the government, especially the Treasury, has been speaking for years of the Public Investment Corporation, the PIC, as if it's government money, as if they can use government money for all sorts of political purposes, bailing out South African Airways. And, there was mentioned, for example, housing or transformation, all of which are fine objectives, but they would be probably criminally reprehensible if those objectives are pursued by fund managers, because it is not government money, this is private money, and the fund managers and the trustees have one and only one purpose, which is to maximize the value of the people whose money is entrusted to them, and those are the pensioners. Another thing that everyone should be clear about is that the PIC is the biggest investor in South Africa. It is the single biggest investor on the stock exchange. It is itself the most spectacular example of transformation. It is the way in which, the means by which black South Africans have acquired a very substantial, in fact the biggest single ownership of shares on the stock exchange, and many other investments, not just listed shares. So it is an amazing achievement by black South Africans for themselves, and for the government to hijack their money for political purposes and for the managers to allow that to happen is quite possibly a criminal offense.
Adil Nchabileng, President of Transform RSA, are you of the view that it is perhaps political interference that has led to the allegations that we've seen at the PIC? Just on closer inspection, some of the investments that they've made in companies have yielded negative returns of up to -70%. Clearly, that can't be pragmatic investment or prudent.
Indeed. This was one of the most actually shocking news that we've just received with regards to the losses of pensioners and workers' monies that has been used to be invested and fund companies that are underperforming, first of all. Some of the companies are retaining 1% at a time. Some are retaining about 6%, which is not even a dividend return or yield that can be expected to actually pay back the amount of money that they borrowed against. One of the shocking ones is one politician, very well known, who used to be a minister in government, was funded for 9.5 billion. I mean, these are shocking news that we should actually be shocked about, to know that we have the PIC, which is a public investment corporation, using public pensioners' funding and money to actually fund people who already have had opportunities previously and had benefited. And not only that, to fund to a tune of 9.5 billion rand to buy companies that are going against the South Africa's government transformation laws, as well as empowerment-based equity laws and legislation. So it is quite a shock that from Transformers' point of view, we are actually noting to understand that indeed we have a long way to go with regards to transformation. If there can be such political interference and such political leveraging and muscling, and by the way, this is not political interference by the ANC determining as to who gets the contracts and who gets the awarding of funding from the PIC. This has been individual politicians that have already been highlighted on the report as to being beneficiaries. So people have been using their own particular political clout and profile to go and access this amount of money, and somehow they know how the process works. And yet, a lot of people who came with genuine business ideas, who approached PIC, for instance, for funding, were always turned down and were never given the necessary financial support. If not, the funding was actually just specifically given to pals
Mr.
and
Khadima,
friends.
is the answer then to decentralize that core function of 80% of the funds, the 2.2 trillion, being managed by the PIC themselves? Because with that would come the temptation, or rather the tendency to override processes, because you've got ultimate control.
Yeah, look, first and foremost, I question the logic of handing out 400 billion rand into the hands of these private companies, which are, in case of South Africa, they will be regarded as white monopoly capital, because all those fund managers, when you look at them, that have got this concentration of the 400 billion rand that PIC, by their own account, they say we've given to them to manage as fiduciary. They're not asking the hard questions. On the 80%, by all means, but what we are poor in understanding right now is that, well, if you are buying equities, there has to be an analyst. I don't know who is the top-rated panel of analysts who are industry subject matter experts that are advising PIC in terms of which equities, which share on the JSE they should be buying, where they have deployed the 1.6 trillion rand into. So for that, we are poorer. So we don't know the background. Why are you buying share A instead of share B? But also, on the other hand, the point that I have consistently made, whenever we talk about matters that are economic as well as business-wise, I've always made a point that the Johannesburg Securities Exchange is one of the most liquid and yet one of the poorest in terms of new money that goes into investment into productive industries. People can just think about, you'll be hard-pressed to know how many companies this year listed to raise money to go into productive sectors. So I'm asking, why would the PIC therefore say it is their mandate, or they've been mandated by the Government Employees Pension Fund to invest in industries, if they do equities, that there must be sustainability and job creation? And right now, we are not seeing that, because job creation can only come as a result of productive industries. As a country, we are dealing with a huge a perennial trade deficit. We are importing more finished goods than we are making locally, because our manufacturing sector, Statistics South Africa tells us, is perpetually in decline. So the question is, what are we going to do? It's not sufficient for the PIC to protest that there are other people who want to hijack or want to capture PIC, when we are now asking the harder questions and about their performance, and their performance has been lackluster by their own account.
Okay, talking about accountability, Zamo, I mean, the CEO, Dan Matjela, has vehemently denied any allegations or wrongdoing, in fact saying that the fund is in good hands and that they have management par excellence, if you like. But we've seen with this report, particularly in certain industries, as Tshepo was saying, that do not meet their own targets and mandate of creating necessary job creation and also return on investment for their own stakeholders, who are largely civil employees who've invested their pensions. Does the buck stop with Dan Matjela, or should it be the board and all the executives at the PIC?
Well, the CEO is the head of the executive management. The buck does stop with him, and he's also part of the board. Yeah, it's not the board is separate from him, as I believe him and the CFO would be on the board as well. So the buck literally does stop with him. If anyone's head is going to be shot down, it's got to be his head, because this has happened under his watch. And we all going to need to have to put on a good pair of strong glasses to look at what has been happening and actually ask ourselves as a status quo, even over the last 23, 24 years, because I don't understand how in our environment anybody could say that 46 billion is a drop in the ocean. 46 billion would happen. I mean, if you gave that to the Minister of Finance and told him that he could collect that extra in taxes, he would be so ecstatic, because it would only, his shortfall then would be 4 billion. So 46 billion is not a drop in the ocean in our environment. It's a huge amount of money. So the PIC is going to have to account. I would not wish to jump the gun and say that there has been wrongdoing, but from a desktop analysis, it's not looking good. That Isiba, I find, looks like a dog's breakfast. There's none of those investments look like, yes, we are making hay out of the 46 billion we've put down.
Yeah, Leon, just very quickly, in terms of punitive action that should be taken, you know, what is, especially once we've gotten to the bottom of the investigation that the finance minister instituted, in your view, what is a suitable punishment in this case?
Well, let's be very clear that the punishment should be for failing to meet the obligation, which is really very simple. It's not complicated. It's got nothing to do with jobs, transformation. Their sole responsibility is to protect the security and increase the returns for the people whose money it is. That is black South African civil servants, with few exceptions. And 46 billion is enough for 40,000 RDP homes. So what should happen is, in my view, it shouldn't be the minister investigating, it should be the prosecuting authority. This should be considered a potential criminal act of breach of trust. And I think the CEO is maybe where the buck stops, but let me suggest that every director who comes to any meeting and sees before them records or proposals to make investments which are not in the interests of their sole mandate. Their sole mandate is to look after the funds of the pensioners. And if they do anything other than that, I think it is true to say that that is a criminal act of breach of good faith.
And also we've seen the Portfolio Committee on Finance, its chair, Eunice Karim, almost seeming reluctant not to have a probe into the PIC. Earlier on, you mentioned that there had been politically influential people who've been tapping into the PIC funds for their own personal gain. Do you think that that would be one of the reasons why this probe is not so well received?
Indeed, it was clear that actually there has been individuals who have been receiving benefits, and that is why actually the Portfolio Committee on Finance was actually not keen into looking into this matter. It is good that the Minister of Finance, in Treasury in this case, has actually requested this probe to actually happen, and has actually requested to say, show the South Africans the true reflection of what is happening. The fund is underperforming. This is the reality right now. The current monies that has been invested is not put into the right areas. The businesses that have been funded, if you start seeing the health of the funding itself, you start seeing that some of these businesses are in a loss-making state, and they're not going to be able to pay back the amount of money, which means billions of workers' funds, billions of workers' pensions, billions of workers' monies has actually been lost. We are not only talking about workers who are currently being employed, we're talking about people who are retired, whose money has been put in risk, and as a result is not going to be returned at this rate. And there has been a lot of wastage of public funds, and this is something that needs to be looked into. And if needs be, those criminal procedures and actions must be taken against those people who unfairly and unduly benefited. It is not right to have South Africa today in 2017, whereby we still have a public investment corporation that borrows money to friends in order to perpetuate the same stereotype of empowering white monopoly capital companies and ensuring that the black people stay outside the periphery of the economy.
So how do we ensure that the story retains traction and momentum so that we get to the bottom of it? What is likely to be uncovered in terms of the names and faces of who the true beneficiaries are in these supposed investments?
Look, I've seen the list of the 46 billion rand that has been invested. There are very few politicians. The rest are establishment. They are white companies, either money managers or in industries. They are the ones that took the bulk of the 46 billion. So effectively, PIC has not been able to walk the talk in terms of transformation and using its and also as far as the equities on the JSE, we lament the days when Mr. Brian Molefe was the CEO of PIC because he was an activist shareholder. Right now, we've got an exceedingly passive shareholder. If anything, the noise we are hearing is a very, it's not a good noise from PIC saying that they want to have more say on how state-owned companies are running, when at the end of the day they have got almost 2 trillion rand invested in private companies on the JSE without any question whatsoever as to how those companies are investing in this economy. And what we are seeing a very belligerent private sector that is enjoying the largesse of PIC and can sit with 1.4 trillion rand that they are refusing to invest in productive sectors of this economy, and PIC is silent when it's supposed to be using its leverage, its muscle, to be able to get those companies to invest in productive sectors. And the Minister of Finance, is about time that on the overall 9 trillion rand of pensions and saving, he reverses the prescription of 25% offshore investments, because that is the chief source of the bigger risk.
I can guarantee you that this is a story that we're not going to let go of, and we will be bringing it to you in bite sizes to understand exactly who the supposed investors and beneficiaries are of the PIC in protection in the interests of employees' pension of government servants. But thanks to our panelists, as always, Adil Ntabeleng, Transform RSA President, Leon Lowe, Free Market Foundation Executive Director, Zamo Madlala, Radical Economic Transformation Coalition spokesperson, and we had Tsepo Khadima. Are you getting a double dose? A political analyst joining us in studio. Do stay with us. Up next, ANC decides with Mfundo Mabalane.